Hey, HannahMouse1 here. In this video, I'll be showing you my process of making and putting together the Christmas gifts that I gave this year, starting off with this model of my friend as an Inkling from the Splatoon games. I started with making a frame for the model's base out of cardboard circles. I wanted to make it look like it was made of liquidy ink, so I made it so that it had a slight hourglass shape by using a smaller circle in between the layers of circles of larger radii, and I glued these together with basic PVA glue. And I smoothed things out and covered the cardboard's tiny holes by gluing over them with tissue. I then whipped up some PaperMache by massaging paper scraps into a flour, water and salt mixture until smooth. I used this to build up a lip around the edge of the base and added teardrop shaped pieces to make a small splash on one side and a big splash on the other, as though the ink is being sprayed up, and to make it look like a puddle of ink, I built out the bottom edge to look like an inky splat shape. For the model itself, I started with something that I don't usually do, and that's to make an armature. I did this because of how thin I wanted the limbs to be, and I made the armature from a bamboo skewer that I cut into appropriately sized pieces. I sanded these so that the PaperMache would adhere, and for the torso I used a small rectangle of cardboard. I used UV resin to assemble all of the limbs because of its strong bond and quick drying time. I also used it to attach the legs to the torso. Before I could attach the arms, I wanted to block out what he'd be holding, which is my friend's favourite weapon, the sloshing machine. I made it from cardboard shapes, which I attached with scraps of paper to form a net, and then folded it into the shape of the weapon. And having made that, I attached the arms in positions that would allow him to hold it. Next, I cracked out some more PaperMache to make the Inkling's oversized trainers, building up the area around the heel and positioning the shoes onto the base, using the body armature to ensure that they're in the right places. And I used more mache to bulk out the joints and muscles such as the thighs and glutes, because while I wanted thin limbs, I didn't want him to be so literally stick thin. And then I made the Inkling's head by adding details to a PaperMache sphere such as hair and ears. The hairstyle is something that I really wanted to use to make this kinda look like my friend, so I chose the Splatoon hairstyle that seemed to fit his look the closest, creating a good balance between him IRL and the Inklings that we see in the game. And then I added more detail to the sloshing machine, like the machine's drum and front plate, side details and handles. I made all of these from cardboard and used paper scraps to hold them together and tissue scraps to hide any gaps or seams. With that done, I could then get to sculpting the surrounding areas such as the hands, positioned as appropriate around the handles and pressed against the sides of the machine, as well as the Inkling's shirt. And one thing you should know about my friend is that he really loves his cat. So I gave his little Inkling self a little kitty cat companion who'll be sitting in the pool of ink. I think this little guy comes out so cute, I love it so much. I sculpted it, then added it to the base. Then I applied a layer of gesso, which is a paint primer, to ensure that my poster paints adhere to the model nicely. And then I moved on to the paint job. My friend's a bottle blonde, so I went with a bright yellow for the hair and corresponding ink colour. I painted the details onto the sloshing machine, using a metallic paint for the inside of the drum and for the Inkling's clothing. I went with blues and purples as these nicely contrast against the yellow. And then I did some detail work, like the Inkling's black eye mask and eyes, as well as some of the details on the cat based on what his real life cat looks like. The inky areas looked a bit flat, so I added depth by using a wash of watered down dark paint that I dabbed on and then wiped away the excess, as well as some light dry brushing, where you use a minimal amount of paint on the brush and skim it across the surface so that only the very top details get painted. And I mixed a little paint with some UV resin and used it on the cat's paw to make it look like he's playing with the paint, as well as around the shoes and tips of the splashes to make it look a bit wetter and shinier and, well, inkier basically. Next, I added some details onto the hair like an ombre, as well as yellow and orange dots that convey more of the squid half of the Inkling's look. And one final detail for the sloshing machine, I used a paper clip for the metal ring around the opening of the machine's drum and glued that in place. And I finished it off with, well, a finish. I used gloss Mod Podge on any inky areas, the eyes and the inside of the drum, and a matte Mod Podge everywhere else to create a nice contrast. Because my Mod Podge is really old, I watered it down a bit to make sure that it dries clear. With that, gift number 1 is complete. The next gift that I made was a My Neighbor Totoro book nook for my granddad. He's always saying how much he loves this one very specific scene where you first see the Neko bus, so I made it into a diorama for him. I started by measuring out rectangles of cardboard so that they'll fit into an average bookshelf in between the average reading books. I did this by measuring them against a random book that I pulled off my own shelf, drew the outlines and cut all of these out. I then started to glue down scraps of tissue onto the base to create an effect of this being a rough grassy country lane, with the centre being smoother and the edges being rougher as though they're overgrown. I painted the side panels to roughly resemble a dark forest. I didn't go particularly detailed with it as it was meant to be more implied, and did the back and top panels in a really dark, almost black blue. Once the paint on the side panels was dry, I blended the colours together a little by giving everything a dark wash, which is just watered down paint. For the Neko bus, I started with the front of the actual bus by taking a rectangle of cardboard and rounding off the corners, and drawing on details such as the windows and the destination sign. I cut these out by piercing the card with my felting awl and then using the hole to get in the scissors. For the face part, I started by drawing and cutting out a squashed oval, and to make it domed, I took strips of paper and curved them over the oval. Once I had a decent base to support it, I created the surface of the face by gluing over scraps of tissue until I built up something solid. I glued the bust back panel onto another piece of the same shape and then glued the face onto that, sealing the gap with more tissue scraps and adding cardboard triangles for the ears. To make the back of the bust a bit more 3D, I took a strip of paper and cut out small tabs into the edges, which I used to glue the strip down onto another curvy cornered rectangle as well as a back panel. I also sealed up any gaps with a bit more tissue, and I made a bust stop by cutting out a cardboard circle, rolling up a strip of paper and using the tissue to combine them, and then using more tissue to attach that onto a base, another circle of cardboard. For Totoro, I started with 2 semicircles of card that I attached at a right angle with little L's of paper. Much like with the Nekobus's face, I built the curvature with strips of paper which I then covered over with a layer of glued on tissue. And I added one more detail to the bust stop, the timetable board, which is a rectangle of card that I glued on and sealed in place with a scrap of tissue. I then whipped up a batch of PapierMache, which I used for the Nekobus's nose, paws and the little mice lights that are on the top of the bus. I also used it to build up Totoro's face and to give him a nose and little diamond shaped ears, as well as arms, one of which is down by his side and the other tilted up as he'll eventually be holding an umbrella. I also made a PaperMache version of the sisters Sasuke and Mei, which was so tiny that it was hard to add much in the way of actual detail, but I was able to get something that, once painted, would have enough information there to give the impression of who they're supposed to be. I then made the tiny umbrellas by cutting out circles of paper, adding a slit and twisting them in on themselves to make them a little bit cone shaped. I used a roll of paper for the handles and also cut some semicircular indents into the larger umbrella as an added detail. I put the big umbrella into the Totoro's hands, holding it in place with a scrap of tissue, and I used a bit more PaperMache to make the grips on the ends of the handles. To bring the side panels into the third dimension, I used PaperMache to make some thin trees. This just adds a bit of visual interest and helps to sell the notion that they're in a forest. Because all of the detail is in the bottom of the Nook, I created a panel to fill the top portion of the front, shaped to look like leaves, and painted that black on the inside. You won't be able to see that, but just in case. And I then gave all the little models a base coat of gesso, so the bus and his feet, the bus stop, Totoro, Sasuke, Mei, all of it needed to be primed for paint. And then I moved on to the actual paint jobs. Again, I'm just using basic poster paints for this. They do the job just fine. And you might notice me jumping around a lot with this one, and there are 2 main reasons for this. First and most importantly, it allows me to stay productive and keep working even while other pieces are drying. And also, I use the same colours of paint a lot of the time. I used a lot of the same colours of paint on a lot of different elements. So the brown for the dark patches on the Nekobus is the same as Satsuki's hair, and the trees on the side panels. Mei's raincoat and boots are the same colour as the bus stop. I used the skin pink that I used on Sasuke on a variety of different pieces. A few things required a couple coats because these poster paints are inherently a tad bit transparent, but other than that it was all smooth sailing. I then did some white detailing on the bus stop and the Nekobus, and painted the umbrella handles and bus stop pole with a metallic silver, and did some details such as the leaf, chest spots and face on the Totoro. I used glow in the dark paint for any of the lit up parts of the bus like the mice or the windows. Then I stuck the Nekobus onto the back panel, including his little paws, and stuck everything else into their places on the base plate. I then used gloss Mod Podge on the bus's lights to make them look nice and shiny, and also on recessed areas of the path on the base and Totoro's umbrella to make them look wet, because in the film it had just been raining pretty heavily. Next I assembled the structure of the book Nook by putting together the back, side and base plates and connecting everything together with scraps of paper that acts as support hinges and holds everything in place. And this was only about the fiddliest and most frustrating part of the entire process. And for the outside of the Nook, I wanted a leafy collage effect, so I mixed up 3 pots of differently coloured watered down paints and filled each with scraps of paper and left it to soak. While those were staining, I gave the box a coat of gesso just in case the paper scraps weren't completely opaque. I didn't want any Cheerio pictures from the box I used to make the Nook peeking through. I then stuck pieces of paper down of no real rhyme or reason to make a natural looking collage effect, and once that was done, I drew on the My Neighbor Totoro logo as well as a couple of dust bunnies in the corner as a subtle bit of detail. I finished all of that off with a nice layer of gloss Mod Podge, and with that the second gift was complete. With another one of my friends, we have a running tradition where I bake him something each year, and we both love Five Nights at Freddy's, so I made him these FNAF cupcakes. The cupcake recipe itself was nothing special, just a basic recipe from my quote-unquote cookbook for girls that I've had for years because boys can't bake cupcakes apparently. It was just a sift together the dry ingredients, so flour, sugar, baking powder, salt, and whisk together the wet ingredients, egg, milk, which I used almond milk, oil and vanilla extract, and then folding the wet into the dry. I saw a hack on Instagram where you put dry rice under the cupcake cases in the baking tin, and that stops them from getting greasy or something, and it seemed to work pretty well. I spooned the batter evenly into the cupcake cases and put them into the oven to bake. The first set of cupcakes that I made were based on Chica's cupcake Carl, so I took some ready roll icing and massaged it to get it nice and soft, added red food colouring to make it the bright pink that Carl's icing is. I used a flower shaped cookie cutter to create the icing shape, and initially I used a cutter that was a bit too small and had to go up a size. I removed the cupcake case from the cupcake and used some ready roll white icing to create Carl's little buck teeth, and then topped it off with the pink icing flour. For the whites of the eyes I used triangles of more ready roll roll icing, and I made him look kinda angry because I thought that was cute in a fun way. I'll add the pupils later, and I made 4 of these little Carl cupcakes. For the Freddy cupcakes, I broke up some chocolate and set that to melt over a double broiler, while I broke some Oreos in half and extracted the Oreo fluff as I needed the cookies to make the rim of the top hat. I decased 4 cupcakes and removed the tops to create a flat surface, and then used melted chocolate to hold the cookie in place. I then took 4 marshmallows, coated them in chocolate and placed them onto the cookies before spreading the chocolate across the top of the Oreo cookies. The ears, I started by cutting up more marshmallows then coating them in chocolate, but the chocolate was not melting properly, and in my ignorance I added milk in hopes of thinning it out. According to my mum, it should have been butter because milk basically turned it into brownie batter, but I decided to roll with it and made the ears and muzzles out of this cakey mixture. For the eyes, I added circles of Oreo fluff onto each cake and pressed a bit more Oreo cookie into each. I added dark chocolate chunks to each cake as Freddy's big old boopable button nose. And finally I went back to the Carls and gave the Oreo pupils to them too, and with that the FNAF cupcakes were finished. The final thing I had to make was this Wizard of Oz picture frame for my dance teacher. Every year we put on a pantomime along with a local acting group, and I always draw her a picture of the dancers. And because I had this frame from a recent clear out of the living room, I decided to paint it in reference to the pantomime itself, a play on the Wizard of Oz, the Wizard of What. I started by separating the main frame from everything that comes with it, and gave that a coat of gesso to prep it for paint. This was pretty important for this project due to the smoothness of the frame's surface, and I'll be using acrylic instead of poster paints for this particular task. I brought the inner frame, the one that goes under the glass, back in as I quickly did a sketch of my design. I say my design, is really just the classic shot from the posters with the yellow brick road leading to the Emerald City. And then I started with the base coat colours for the main frames, beginning with the bright yellow that the brick road gets its name from. I kept this fairly simple to begin with just block colours, except for the blue of the sky where I did a light to dark gradient, and a lighter curve to frame the Emerald City. I often struggle with blending colours like this, but because these colours were fairly similar it wasn't too much of a challenge, and I had to make sure to paint the sides of the lip of the frame, as well as the inner frame where I had to match the sky's gradient and highlight effects. I then did the grey base coat for the rocks and cliff face on both the outer main frame and the inner frame, as well as the distant hills, which I did a muted forest green. And then I moved on to the first element of actual detail, the poppies. To make these I took a really cheap paintbrush, the kind with the plastic bristles that you get in kids comics or craft kits that you can't paint with to save your life, and I used it to stipple on patches of white wherever I wanted the poppies to go. I did it in this way because it stops it from looking too smooth and the splotches resemble flowers. The only real difficulty came in making sure that the inner and outer frames lined up properly. I then went over this with a layer of red applied in the same way, and the splotchiness allowed a bit of the white to peek through. It creates, to use a Mariah Elizabethism, a painterly look I've never really played with before, but I really like how it came out in this case. And luckily the lining up of the frames issue was mitigated on this layer because all I had to do was go over anywhere where the first white layer had already covered. And finally I did the same thing again in pink, but this time I did it a lot more roughly so that a substantial amount of the red and a little of the white could show through. At this point I decided to commit to the painterly look and began stippling on the highlights and shadows all over the grass. I love how it conveys a lot of detail at a scale that might otherwise make it difficult to show, and use the same shades of light and dark green to add detail to the Emerald City, except here instead of a stippling motion I skimmed the brush up and down to make it look smoother and less organic than the fields, and more like light reflecting off a glass or metal surface. I used the same technique on the rocks, using highlights and shadows to imply their general form and shape. I actually switched from the plastic brush to a soft detail brush for the shadows as I needed a bit more control to apply these shapes, but I kept to the loose stippled look, and I also added shadows to the distant hills. Next I added detail to the yellow brick road, trying to strike a balance between there being enough detail to show the brick texture whilst maintaining the loose, sketchy, rough style that I've been using for the rest of the piece. I did this with a combination of dabbing and skimming the brush over the page, avoiding smooth motions or lines. And I did, of course, continue this pattern on the inner frame as well. Although they don't appear in most versions of the Wizard of Oz poster, I decided to add a few fluffy white clouds into the sky, as the simple blue gradient was too smooth in relation to the painterly look of the rest of the frame. I used the same stippling motion that I used for the poppies, again starting in white, but this time progressing to a pale blue and a pale pink. I focused the blue on lower parts of the cloud to act as shadows, and pink on the upper parts to act as highlights. And I kept bringing in the inner frame to make sure that everything was lining up. I did the underside of the frame in a basic green. There was no real reason to put any effort into this design for the back because it will spend most of its life up against a wall, but I had to paint it for the frame to feel finished, so doing a simple green seemed like a good compromise of effort to payoff. I also wrote the name and year of the performance on the inner frame, starting with a bold white thick lettering to act as a contour, then doing the actual lettering in a black alcohol marker. And it says 2024 because the pantomime's actual performances are in January rather than December. And I gave the outer frame a few coats of gloss Mod Podge to make sure that the paint is all protected. And finally, to make the frame a little bit more glitzy, I used gold glitter, both the fine and chunky variety on the yellow brick road, by mixing it with a bit more Mod Podge and layering that on. I did the same in shades of pink over the poppy fields, as well as a silver for the Emerald City. I think that this just gave the frame a final bit of pop. And with that, the frame was complete, and that brings us to the end of this video. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed it. Like and subscribe if you did, it lets me know there's something you want to see more of. Let me know in the comments which of these pieces you liked the most. Join the Discord linked in the description, and I'll see you next week with another video. Bye!